Okay, so what is literary analysis? Well, basically, it's an interpretation of a written text that involves the use of concepts specifically associated with literature. In many respects, it's not that different from an argumentative essay. The tools are basically there. It's just fine-tuned to work with literature. Also, I want to point out too, real quick, this will be an MLA assignment. Okay, you can use MLA. In fact, I want you to use MLA format for this particular assignment because it's a humanities course. Oh, it's literature is within the division of humanities, and it's good for you to be bilingual. Okay, and by bilingual, I mean you should be versed in both APA and MLA formats. Okay. So, moving on. Literary concepts, here are the basics. The plot, this is the story, how it moves along. The setting, where does the story take place? And this can factor into your story and the arguments you make about it. This is particularly true of our story of Othello, which takes place in a specific setting. Whose name just escaped me. Anyway, characterization. Who are the players and what are their motivations? What are they interested in? Again, particularly interesting in the play Othello because we take the character of Othello and our dastardly villain Iago. What does he want? What is his driving force? Symbolism. Great metaphor. Great source for writing papers. The symbolism of, say, a rose for Emily. There is among the many symbols in that story, there is the watch that Miss Emily carries on a chain, as if she has time itself bound. And there's the ticking of the watch. Metaphors. Right? When metaphors are what something that stands in for something else. Right? My favorite metaphor, poetry is the smile on the face of truth. Right? Irony or ambiguity, of course, these factor in. Genre, you could go with genre, like when we read a Western, we're expecting a certain set of genre-specific conventions. The man on his horse, gunplay, horses, roping cattle, that kind of thing. Irony and ambiguity, of course, let's see, in O. Henry's The Necklace, for example, the couple are given care of this necklace and they lose it, and so they essentially come to ruination of their own fortunes trying to replace it, only to find out it's practically worthless. And the same thing will factor into the matter of the handkerchief in Othello. Narration and ambiguity. Narrators can be a tricky lot. You can have the omniscient narrator, the narrator who knows everything, sees all, tells all, and you can also have an undependable narrator. My favorite example is a story called Why I Live at the P.O. And Why I Live at the P.O., we have the narrator named Sister who is narrating a story about some incidents that happened with her family and how she wound up leaving them to go live at the post office. She's the undependable narrator because we're only getting her point of view and her sense of things. Right? Now, additional concepts. Historical content. When you're writing a narrative or when you're writing a literary argument, you can talk about, well, this occurred in this period in history, and this story is affected by the historical conditions in which it was written. When I did my master's thesis, I was writing about Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, which was published in 1992. And what appeared to be the story was set in the 50s, with the boom of the oil industry in Texas and the beginning when the ranch system was kind of beginning to fade a little bit. But the story being published in 1992 places it in a very different context, because in 1992 we were engaged in the first Gulf War, and a war that many people said was about oil. So here we have an American cowboy in the story going down to Mexico trying to impose his cowboy dream on a society there that has no use and no interest in him. Mexico, at a time when we have American troops going to a foreign land to fight a dictator, and a lot of people said this was over oil. Okay. Social significance. What did this say? For example, To Kill a Mockingbird. That novel has had a lot of critics over time, and a lot of discussion about its importance or its impact on society at large. Even now, the Broadway play has sort of retooled the story for its own needs to discuss the current situation and the race relations in America, which brings us to political point of view, of course. What are the politics of the writer? What is the slant of the story? Ideology, critical orientation, literary theory, and multiple voices. You can, let's see, there are as many schools of literary theory as there are stories. Right? For example, there is formalism, there is historicism, which is probably one of the easier ones to do because you just look at the history and you say, well, it is for me anyway. I consider myself a historicist. And you look at historical documents, you look at the historical conditions of the time. There is the oppressor-oppressed schools, where the literature is looked at in terms of the oppressed voices, people who were being oppressed at the time. Harriet Tubman's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Actually, that man, I'm sorry. I'm not sure of the author. I think it was Harriet Tubman, but it's been a little bit. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This is an example of the oppressor-oppressed school, because this is a woman who was pretty much served at the height of oppression, was put upon by society, and spoke out, wrote her narrative as an act of resistance. Okay. It also factors in the political viewpoint, because it became very popular among the abolitionist movement. And finally, multiple voices. If you take a text like Moby Dick, for example, you have not only Ishmael's voice, but you have the voice of the obsessed Captain Ahab, or the voice of Queequeg and others. Okay, so these are just different approaches, different concepts to look into as you're approaching your narrative or your literary analysis. So now, how do you argue in an analysis? You focus on specific attributes of the text, right? For example, if we were looking at A&P, we would look at Sammy's sense of himself, his ideological heroism, right? Or you might look at A&P as a story about class, right? Because we have Sammy, who is just the local boy, the working staff, versus the out of town, the beach people, the people who come to visit. And there are two very different worlds here. You could look at that as a clash of cultures, perhaps. Or you might look at it as failed idealism. Okay, so make sure your specific points, that is your thesis, make sure they are arguable. Defend your points with reason based on evidence from the text. That is, pull text from the story. It could be dialogue, it could be descriptions, it could be the setting, and so forth. Argue your points much like a legal advocate. You can argue that either the strongest evidence first and the weakest last, or vice versa. Whatever works best in your opinion. Remember, though, your audience is the judge. They're the ones that you're trying to convince. If you're trying to write a Marxist criticism of barn burning, you would argue that Abner Snopes is actually the hero in this, and that Sardi is kind of a traitor both to his people and to his family and to his society by siding with the rich Major Despain. Okay, so excuse me. Thesis statement sets the argument to control the focus of the entire paper. Of course, you know this from 101 and from previous essays. It provides unity and a sense of direction. In essence, your thesis points your reader to where the story is going to go. It specifies to the reader, that is your audience, the point of the analysis. It answers the question, why am I talking about this? Right? Your thesis tells your reader what they're going to expect and what your purpose is in writing about this text. Here's a couple of examples. In Death of a Salesman, Miller uses Uncle Charlie's relationship with his successful son Bernard to emphasize Willy Loman's failure as a father. And that's true. I recently taught this for American Lit too. And while Uncle Charlie's son Bernard is a successful lawyer going to prosecute a case before the Supreme Court, Biff can't seem to get it together. Biff is Willy Loman's son. He's problematic. He can't keep a job. He's a thief. And then his other son, Happy, is essentially a con man and a philanderer. Another example, The Great Gatsby presents a world in which marriage, the stock market, and even the World Series are corrupted by selfish greed. Absolutely, too. One of the major themes in The Great Gatsby is money, the acquisition of wealth, and the flaunting of wealth. Finally, Ralph Ellison's Battle Royale highlights the bankruptcy of Booker T. Washington's separate but equal approach to race relations. And if you haven't read Battle Royale, it is well worth your time to look it up and read it. It is a powerful story about race and about inequality in America. All right. How to support a thesis statement. Use examples from the text, direct quotations, it could be summaries of scenes, or paraphrases. A paraphrase, of course, as you know from 101, is when you take the text and you put it in terms that are easier to understand, in essentially your own words. Fine example of it, too, if you're struggling also with the text of Othello, go to, and I can't believe I'm saying this, go to SparkNotes, and they have a site called the No Fear Shakespeare. And on one side of the screen, they have the original Elizabethan English. On the other side, they have modern English translation of it. So it'll help you understand this rather thick Elizabethan prose, and it'll help you really enlighten you as to the text. Okay. Read other critics' opinions. These can lend all sorts of great insight. And doing my master's thesis, I ordered several books of criticism on Cormac McCarthy, and read and benefited greatly from the ideas and thoughts and the analysis of other critics on the work. And you don't necessarily have to agree with the opinion of the other critics. You can argue against them, as we did with the research paper. Consider the historical, social, and economic context. All right. For my master's thesis on All the Pretty Horses, I brought in such text as, believe it or not, Marty Robbins' El Paso City, a record released by the department store Montgomery Ward, as a sort of example of Western lore and literature. I looked up historical records from the town of San Angelo, Texas, from the date of the story itself, and discussed what was going on about that time. And there was a huge cattle die-off, which I used to argue drought, which I used to argue would have made John Grady, the protagonist, his dreams of running a ranch in Texas at that time impossible. Okay. And use secondary sources too. You can read, especially with historicism, you can use any kind of sources from that time period, history books, popular culture. Okay, you can use psychological texts, that sort of thing. Think kind of outside the box. You're not bound by the text itself. Say if we're doing Othello and we look at it as an allegory or a story about a race. I mean, race is absolutely inextricable from the play, although it is a little too far to say this is a play about racism per se, because we know from historical context that the concept of race as we know it today didn't really exist in Shakespeare's time. There were people of other races, but the way we looked at it was different. Okay. There's a wonderful historical context that with Othello that probably informed the writing of the play itself. There was a visitor from the Moorish court. He was a Moorish royalty, and came to visit the court of England at the time as Queen Elizabeth was seeking to establish an alliance with Morocco against Spain, because the Spanish were seeking to unseat Queen Elizabeth because, well, among other things, she refused to marry the King of Spain. And so people had these ideas of what black men were like. And then when they met this prince from the Moorish court and his courtiers, and they were very well educated, they knew things about math and science and culture, and Shakespeare and his men were called to entertain at court. And so it wasn't long after this experience, and all of London was abuzz about this Moorish gentleman, this Moorish royalty who had come to visit. And everyone, it was the way we would think about royalty visiting America, or a rock star showing up, and albeit in an Elizabethan sense of the word. Okay, so what I mean by, I hope you're getting what I mean by secondary sources. You can look at historical texts or psychological texts. In short, think outside the box. Okay, you're not bound by the text itself or by other critics' opinions. You can build your own insights and thoughts, reading about what was going on at the time, or reading texts that essentially inform these stories. Okay, so what is a secondary source? A book or article that discusses the text you're discussing. It can be a critical review. It can be a book or article that discusses a theory related to your argument. It can be a book or article that discusses the social, political, or economic context of the text that you're discussing. Right? Getting back to John Updike's A&P, there are political references there that harken back to the time the story was written, which was somewhere in the height of the Cold War, right? And which also kind of factors into the whole idea of capitalism versus communism, capitalism as, or maybe prosecuting capitalism as a system that maybe kind of alienates people and separates them. Okay. In my humble opinion, still the worst system in the world is, only in so much as it's better than all the other systems. Right? I can't remember Churchill's actual quote. He says, "Capitalism is the worst system of government in the world, except for all the other systems of government." Neither here nor there. How do you integrate your secondary sources? Be sure to show how a secondary source relates to your thesis. I got a paper back from my British Lit professor, and it said, "Make it mean." Okay, and she didn't mean make it unkind or cruel. She means make it mean something. Make sure it relates to your text. Don't overuse any one secondary source, or for that matter, secondary sources in general. What we are looking for is your thoughts and your opinions on this, as demonstrated and backed up by several different texts. Remember, this is your paper, your argument. Secondary sources just help brace your argument. And never, ever plagiarize from a secondary source. Okay? This is the kind of thing I warn my 101 students about. Plagiarism will follow you like a bad smell. Don't do it. Additional strategies, and this happens to all people who are writing about literature one time or another. You start writing and the writing's going really well, and you get done with it and you realize, I've just retold the story. I don't need you to retell the story. I've already read it. So will most of your readers. So don't do a lot of summary. You have to do about, the golden rule is about twice as much summary as twice as much analysis as summary. So if you do 3 lines of summary, do 6 lines of analysis. Narrow the scope of your response. Don't try to swallow the whole world in one bite. You say if you're doing Othello, talk about a scene, or talk about a theme. It could be an issue of mistrust, or you talk about Iago's motivations, perhaps. What is it that drives him? What is it that drives Othello? Don't try to encompass the entire literary text. Go through and find the quotes or the incidents or the scenes that support the topic you want to write about, and focus on those. Pre-write. Always pre-write to explore the topic and develop a thesis. Okay. By pre-writing, you begin to figure out what it is you know, and what you like about the text, and what you want to talk about. Oftentimes, something that really helps you, that really makes a good paper, is something in the text that bugs you. But why does he do this? Why does he think this way? What's happening with this? Okay. Yeah. Support your thesis from evidence from the text, of course. I am fond of telling my students that there's really no wrong way to do a literary analysis. You can argue pretty much, well, actually, let me back that up. You can argue anything about a text as long as you can prove it from that text. Okay? What I mean is, you could argue that, like, okay, let's say barn burning, that this is, that actually Sardi, who was the son of Abner Snopes, the barn burner, you could argue that he's actually the villain because he turns on his family. And if you read this text as a story of class struggle, he has betrayed both his class and his family. And as a result, he is the villain of the tale. Not my favorite reading, but definitely a plausible one. Okay, avoid extensive direct quotations. Do not turn in a paper that is a bunch of block quotes held together by a little bit of connective tissue. This will not serve you well. Now, when we're writing about literature, we always write in the present tense. Yes, because it is a story, and stories are, well, evergreen. We're approached as if they're always taking place in the present. After writing your first draft, review the work, examine your thesis and supporting evidence, proofread, and then rewrite. Do not rely on spell check. Spell check is not your friend. If it is spelled correctly but in the wrong context, it will not flag it. If it is a name with a particularly unique spelling, it will try to correct it, or maybe it will mark it wrong. Don't trust it. I once turned in a paper with the author's last name spelled incorrectly the whole way through. Somehow I got away with it, mostly probably because of the great mercy of my professor. So, yeah, spell check, not your friend. All right, so that is the end of